It was the beginning of something unfamiliar. When Mom remarried, I found myself standing in front of a new house, trying to pretend like it didn't feel like a stranger's home. It was beautiful, quiet neighborhood, trimmed lawn, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a movie. But I missed the creaky floors of our old apartment, the cramped kitchen, and the scent of home-cooked food lingering in the air. Nothing here smelled like home yet. Inside, everything was clean and organized, as if no one had ever lived there. My room was upstairs, across from his. My stepbrother, Ryan. I had seen him maybe 3 times before the move. We barely exchanged hellos at the wedding, and now we were supposed to live under the same roof and act like family. Whatever that meant. The first few days passed in a blur of unopened boxes and stiff conversations. Ryan was polite, almost too polite. He kept to himself, rarely left his room, and only nodded when we crossed paths. I could tell he was trying in his own quiet way to not make things uncomfortable, but the silence between us stretched too long sometimes, thick with everything neither of us said. One night, it rained hard. Thunder cracked across the sky, like it was tearing the world open. I was curled up in bed, wrapped in a blanket, trying to drown out the storm with music when there was a gentle knock at the door. "Hey," he said, peeking in. "You okay?" I nodded, caught off guard. "Yeah, just the storm." He hesitated, then stepped in, glancing around. "It gets loud in this house. The roof's high, makes everything echo." I smiled faintly. "You've lived here longer than me. I guess I'll get used to it." He leaned against the doorframe. "Maybe, but it took me months." That was the first time he said more than 2 sentences to me. It felt surprisingly normal, like we were just 2 people trying to find our place in a house that didn't quite feel like home yet. We talked for a bit, about nothing in particular. The weather, school, the way the lights flickered during storms. I noticed he had paint on his fingers, little smudges of color. He told me he was into sketching and sometimes painted when he couldn't sleep. I told him I used to write short stories, though I hadn't written anything in a while. There was something calming about his voice, steady and low, like he'd already made peace with a lot of things I was still learning to accept. Before he left, he paused at the door again. "If the storm gets worse, you can text me. I'm just across the hall." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. After he left, I stared at the door for a while, feeling a little less alone. Maybe it wasn't home yet, but that night, something softened in the air between us. And it stayed that way. Something shifted after that night. We didn't talk about it, but we didn't need to. The silence between us felt different, warmer, easier. Ryan started showing up in little ways. A knock before dinner, a shared glance during breakfast, casual jokes in the hallway. He wasn't trying too hard, and maybe that's what made it work. Nothing forced, just 2 people finding comfort in the quiet. One afternoon, I was on the couch with a book when he walked in and tossed a small box next to me. Inside was a keychain with a tiny notebook charm. "Saw it at the bookstore. Thought of your writing," he said. It was unexpected and thoughtful. I smiled without saying much. That was how we worked, unspoken appreciation. I started noticing more about him, the way he hummed to himself while making coffee, how he always left the last slice of cake for someone else. He had this calm energy, like he wasn't in a hurry to be anywhere, just present in the moment. We weren't friends before, but now we were quietly becoming something like it. One evening, I came home after a rough day. My backpack was heavy, and my chest felt heavier. I barely made it to my room before the tears started. I didn't even hear the knock, just looked up and saw him standing there. He didn't ask what happened, just walked in, sat beside me, and handed me his hoodie. It smelled like his cologne, fresh, clean, comforting. We didn't speak for a while, just sat there, side by side, and somehow it helped more than any words could have. That became our thing, simple presence. He'd show up when it mattered, and I learned how much that meant. Over time, his room wasn't off limits anymore. I'd walk in to ask him something and end up staying, watching him paint. He never said much while working, but he always let me sit there. Once I asked if I could try, and he handed me a brush like he'd been waiting for me to ask. I was awful, but we laughed, and that was the point. There was this rainy afternoon where I had a migraine, and the thunder made it worse. Ryan came in without knocking, carrying an old record player he'd fixed. He put on the softest music, instrumental, barely there, and sat on the floor, sketching while I rested. I didn't even open my eyes, but I could feel the peace settle over the room like a warm blanket. He didn't need to ask what I needed. He just knew. We never called it anything. Not friendship, not family, not love. It was something in between. Something honest. There was no pressure, no expectations. Just quiet comfort. We shared moments most people would overlook. And somehow, those moments became everything. I started writing again. Not because I had something to prove, but because I finally felt something worth putting into words. It was subtle at first, the way my heart would pause when he walked into a room, or how I'd catch myself watching him from across the dinner table. There was no sudden moment of realization, just a slow unfolding. The way he remembered the smallest things, like how I liked my tea without sugar or how I always flipped to the last page of a book first. He noticed details that no one else ever did, and that kind of attention, it made you feel seen in ways that were hard to ignore. Ryan didn't flirt. He didn't try to be charming. He was just present, and in a world full of distractions, that felt rare. We'd find ourselves talking late into the night, voices low so no one else in the house would hear. Conversations about fears, regrets, memories we hadn't shared with anyone else. I told him about how I used to be scared of being forgotten. He told me about the guilt he carried after his dad passed, like he never said enough. It was raw, real, and oddly beautiful. One night, after a particularly long conversation, he looked at me and said, "You make this place feel less temporary." That sentence stayed with me, because I felt the same. This house wasn't just a house anymore. It was slowly becoming something more, because he was in it, because we were in it together, even if we didn't call it anything yet. I started noticing the way he'd brush past me a little slower, his hand lingering just enough to send my thoughts racing. I'd catch him looking at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, and sometimes our eyes would meet and hold for a moment too long. Still, nothing was said, but everything was felt. Things deepened without needing labels. One afternoon, I fell asleep while writing, and when I woke up, there was a blanket over me and my laptop plugged in. He had left a sticky note that said, "Your words matter." It was simple, but it stirred something in me that I didn't know was still soft. We weren't doing anything wrong. There were no lines crossed, but the connection, whatever it was, felt too significant to ignore. It wasn't about romance in the typical sense. It was emotional safety, mutual understanding, a kind of closeness you don't stumble upon often. The world outside our room was still the same. Family dinners, chores, routines. But inside, between just us, it was different, more real. Sometimes he'd come home later than usual, and I'd pretend I wasn't waiting up. But I was. He'd smile when he saw the lamp still on in my room, and I knew he noticed. We didn't talk about what was happening. Maybe we were afraid that naming it would ruin it, but in those quiet exchanges and subtle glances, something undeniable was growing, something delicate, something we both felt but weren't ready to admit, at least not yet.